On December 31st, 2019, we witnessed one of the most impressive performances we have ever seen in bowl game history. With over 200 rushing yards and the game-winning touchdown pass, Lynn Bowden Jr. practically single-handedly secured a bowl victory for his squad. Now, that stat line right there is a perfect representation of what kind of guy we'll be talking about in this video. This man's college career is truly unlike anything we have seen in a long time, but if I had to pick one career to compare it to, it would be Jabril Peppers, because this guy was everywhere. Lynn spent 3 seasons with Kentucky, and each year was able to greatly contribute to the team in one aspect of the game. In its purest form, Lynn Bowden is just an athlete. He's not an athletic receiver, not an athletic quarterback, not an athletic running back. Simply put, Lynn Bowden is a true athlete that is not limited to one position on the field. Now, we have seen guys who play running back and receiver occasionally, but what separates Lynn is that he played a significant amount of snaps at QB and was somewhat successful during his time behind center. In this video, we take a look at the unique and exciting college career of Lynn Bowden Jr. So let's get into it. So Lynn came out of Warren G. Harding High School in Warren, Ohio, and was an absolute stud during his time there. Bro finished his high school career off with a monster season as he had 1,366 passing yards, along with 2,227 rushing yards and 57 total touchdowns in his senior season alone. Now, that is a very impressive season, but it was not his only impressive year. After 4 years in high school, he had racked up 7,387 rushing yards, which is 6th all-time in the state of Ohio for a high school career. And I don't know, man, to think that 7,300 yards is 6th all time in the state of Ohio is kind of crazy to me. Breaking that down, that is a little under 2,000 rushing yards a year for 4 years straight. So my point is that I can't believe this isn't the record, or at least higher up on the high school career rushing yards list, because I guess high school kids just be rushing for 8,000 yards in a career like it's no problem. Anyway, getting back to Lynn, he was ranked as the number 2 athlete in the country, the number 3 player in Ohio, but the 110th player in the country. And that gap, to me at least, is crazy. So I guess this class was stacked at about every position but athletes, but regardless, dude was a 4-star and committed to the University of Kentucky. Now, from the jump, he made an impact on this team. As you would presume, his freshman year was his least productive, but he got his name out there through special teams while literally adding to every other part of the game besides defense. He finished with 869 return yards. He added to that with 92 passing yards and an interception, 37 rushing yards on 12 attempts, and 17 receptions for 210 yards. But through all of that, through returning, passing, rushing, and receiving, my guy could not find the end zone one time, which is really unfortunate, but anytime you can put up over 1,200 all-purpose yards as a freshman in the SEC, you're doing something right. So although he had not put up any points for his squad, it did not mean that he was not an integral part to this offense. Going into the next season, he was in the preseason All-SEC second team and had some expectations after what he did in just his freshman year. I think Kentucky knew that there was so much more to Lynn than what they were getting out of him, so they were going to make it a point to get the ball in his hands this year, and that's exactly what they did. In that junior season, he had 67 receptions for 745 yards and 5 touchdowns. But that was not even the most impressive part of the season. Just because he was being used more often in the passing game now did not mean that he was still not a force on special teams. He had 25 kick returns for 539 yards, and this is the crazy part, on 5 punt returns, dude had 146 yards and 2 touchdowns. He scored on 40% of the punt returns that he had that year, which is truly insane. Also, a little side note for his stats, I hate to point out the negative, but he went 0 for 1 passing with an interception, so he kind of had a negative 200 QBR, which I just think is funny. But getting back to the year itself, that 2018 Kentucky team actually had a really good season, going 10-3 and finishing 12th in the final AP poll. That 2018 season was the breakout year for Benny Snell, as he had nearly 1,500 yards on the ground and 16 touchdowns. Yeah, thinking about that team now, I personally remember there being a lot of hype around Kentucky because this is when they were not even a respectable football program. So like an 8-4 season would have been huge, but but they went above and beyond. They started the year 5-0 with 2 wins over ranked SEC opponents, and then they eventually lost their 6th game against Texas A&M. So overall, it was probably Lynn's best collegiate year from a team standpoint, but his monster senior season was loading, and I can pretty much guarantee that no one expected what was to come from this man. Looking as Lynn came into his sophomore season as second-team All-SEC, it was only right that he came into his junior year being first-team All-SEC, and that is what he did, and he was about to show everyone just why that was. Now, this Kentucky team was not the same as last year in many ways, but one way that stuck out like a sore thumb was the Wildcats' rushing game. Along with this, the team's quarterback situation was a little sticky because no one they put in was exactly balling out. I'll run through this quickly and then we'll get back to Lynn, but the main guy that season, I'm not even sure if you can call him QB1, was Sawyer Smith, was a transfer from Troy. He ended that year with 690 yards along with 4 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, which is just not going to get the job done at all. Now the other guy was Terry Wilson, who had started for them the last season but truly just was not good enough. The previous year in all 13 games, he had just 1,889 yards with 11 touchdowns and 8 interceptions, which was good enough to skate by because they had Benny Snell to lean on in those high pressure moments when they needed to execute. But with the absence of that kind of rushing attack this year, he needed to step up and take control of this offense and just wasn't able to do so. With those guys being the options at quarterback, there was only one guy who was capable of leading this offense and team, and that was Lynn Bowden. These are his stats for the year, and keep in mind that he started at QB for 7 games, but played in all 13. Through the air, dude had 403 yards with 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. On the ground, which is where he did most of his damage, he had 185 carries for 1,468 yards and 13 touchdowns. As a receiver, he had 30 receptions for 348 yards and an additional receiving touchdown. And finally, as a returner, the guy had 9 kick returns for 220 yards and 4 punt returns for 53 yards. Now, I'm not some all-knowing college football record book, but that stat line right there has got to be one of the most unique stat lines that we will ever see. This football team, which mind you, is a D1 SEC football program, was just throwing this kid wherever he could play like he was the most athletic kid on his Pop Warner team, and he absolutely dominated. I think they did deal with some injuries at QB, which contributed to the amount of time that Lynn played behind center, but looking at their stats, I'm not sure if they would have done much better, even if they had a fully healthy quarterback room. But there was one game from that season that left everyone who watched it in awe of the kind of athlete that they were witnessing, as the 2019 Belk Bowl blessed us with one of the best athletic performances we will see in a while. Due to injuries, Lynn was set to start at quarterback for the Wildcats and did not disappoint. In a very tight game, this man carried the ball 34 times for 233 yards and 2 touchdowns. But it was his arm that won his team the game, as with 15 seconds remaining, down 6, he completed a touchdown pass to Josh Ali and gave his team the lead in the final seconds. I mean, you just can't write it up better than that. Truly, one of the most fitting ways for this man to end his college career. So Kentucky took that game 37-30, and Lynn only finished with 73 passing yards with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. But considering what this man did on the ground and what he had done the entire year, I don't think he cared too much about his passing performance in that final game. To summarize Lynn's final collegiate career, he had 2,510 total yards and 17 total touchdowns, which is crazy. Like, those numbers stand with some of the best seasons we have seen in college football, and it's a shame that no one really talks about what he did. One reason for this is that Lynn was given an absurd amount of opportunities to be an offensive weapon for his team, and when that is the case, he is bound to get a good amount of yards. You gotta think that he contributed in the passing, rushing, receiving, and return game, which is literally every single way you can move the ball or score points, except for a pick 6. But my point is that when athletes put together seasons with the kind of numbers that Lynn had, it is usually from someone who primarily plays just one position but gets the ball in many different ways, opposed to Lynn, who played practically every position and therefore was given more opportunities to acquire those yards. I hope that made sense to y'all, and I'm not trying to downplay what Lynn did at all. I just wanted to point out why people may not talk about or mention the season he had in 2019. In the 2020 draft, he was taken in the 3rd round by the Raiders, but was only with them for a couple of months, as in November of that year, he was traded to Miami for a 4th round pick. With Miami, he had a less than average season, but it was nothing to be ashamed of. He played in 10 games that year and had 28 receptions for 211 yards, but no touchdowns, but also added to that with 9 carries for 32 yards and 1 pass completion for another 32 yards. So, I mean, even in the NFL, this dude was still finding ways to catch, run, and pass the football. The next season in 2021, he spent the entire season on IR and did not make 1 appearance. The year after that, in 2022, he was signed to the Patriots practice squad and only made 1 appearance in 1 game that year with no real stats. Which brings us to the current NFL season, where he is playing for the Saints. After he was waived by the Patriots, the Saints signed him in June of 2023, and he is currently on their active roster and has 10 receptions for 78 yards this year. So during his time in the NFL, he has not had the production that he was hoping for, but at the end of the day, he is currently active on an NFL roster, which is more than a lot of people will ever be able to say. So looking back at this career, with an emphasis on his time at Kentucky, I think there is only one appropriate way to conclude this video, which is pointing out the position that Lynn made 1st and 2nd team All-SEC with. All-purpose back. Until next time, guys.